So let's go over the basics first. Basically, talk about the hormonal changes, physiological changes, secondary sex characteristic changes, kind of the physical changes that happens, and then we're gonna end up talking more so about adolescent sexual behavior mostly, but we'll do these basics first. So Fortenberry and basically all psychologists who theorize about the sexuality of adolescents say that this is a distinct, so qualitatively distinct sexuality than adults, and even, of course, like childhood. So we didn't cover much about childhood, but, childhood, there is like some masturbation and things like that, but it's very obvious once humans hit puberty that we start to think about sex more, masturbate more, so general sexual activity starts to happen a lot more, and just general preoccupation with sex increases. But like Fortenberry is saying right here, is qualitatively distinct sexuality than adulthood. So let's not talk about an 18-year-old as far as an adolescent, but think more so adolescent in terms of like, a 13-year-old. A 13-year-old sexuality is qualitatively different than a 40-year-old, most 40-year-old sexuality. So even though this 13-year-old is thinking a lot more about sex, maybe watching pornography and things like that, they're still not necessarily having intercourse and actually in committed long-term relationships and things like that. So it's this distinct time period, adolescence, that deserves consideration. And at some point I'll talk to you guys about probably a little bit about my my research that I'm doing right now, and that's on compulsive sexual behavior disorder in adolescence. It's kind of an emerging field. Compulsive sexual behavior disorder in general is an emerging research topic, and supposed to be it's called the ICD 11, which is basically like the DSM in the rest of the world and whatnot. So we'll talk about compulsive sexual behavior. What is compulsive sexual behavior in adolescence? So as you know, adolescence is a time of dramatic physiological changes. So as far as secondary sex characteristics, so for girls, breasts start to develop, with hips start to widen, all of these things that are kind of like getting you ready for reproduction and whatnot. And as far as boys, testes drops, and I think testosterone increases, and things like that. And of course, pubic hair, things like that. So testosterone increases during puberty, and estrogen as well, which lead to these physiological changes. And as far as social role development, puberty being a time where being sexual, so things like masturbation increases dramatically as compared to like childhood, and then interest in sexuality, as far as kissing and petting and things like that with a partner intensifies. Desire for that intensifies. So here's I'll explain this pathway model here in a second, but first let's talk about some other stuff, and then we'll get to that. So onset of puberty, generally about 8 to 14 years old, people who are the onset of puberty, but about 2 years earlier in girls. I'm sure y'all already knew that part probably. And so this puberty, as far as neurologically, or more like just like the brain and hormones and whatnot. So let's go to this graph here. So remember, the hypothalamus is part of the brain, and it excretes chemicals into the pituitary gland. Remember, that's still in the brain, and the pituitary gland releases gonadotropins. And so in males, this goes to the testes and increases in testosterone production, and then for girls, it goes into ovaries, and this causes elevated estrogen levels around puberty. Okay, so if you just, survey, I don't think it really should be called young adults. I should have put adolescents, because young adults is a little bit, 11 and 12-year-olds, that's not young adults. Okay, so about 25% of adolescents reporting thinking a lot about sex. So you could imagine that one of the survey questions to like these 11 to 12-year-old boys, by that time they probably, may know what sex is or not. So that's kind of something to think about. But a survey question like, I think a lot about sex, I agree, I disagree, something like that, would give you this sort of data that 25% of adolescents not only say, yeah, I think about sex, but they say, I think about sex. I think a lot about sex, actually. And so just looking at 4th and 5th grade American boys and girls, so remember that's about 9, 10 years old, report that 16% report that yeah, I do think about myself either having sex or just being sexual in general, like masturbating or something like that. And so that was in 2006. So who knows for sure whether it breaks down like that, like 85% of young adolescents, 15% of young adolescents think about sex, and 85% of young adolescents don't think about sex. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but at least Butler in 2006 found that about 15% of young adolescents do think about themselves having sex. And so, of course, in this age range, there's an increase in desire for sexual activity, and sexual desire is more intense and things like that than compared to childhood. And just a little definition here on desire, sexual desire. Desire is a motivational state that generates increased attention to sexual stimuli and variable subjective and physiologic arousal. So during this time of puberty, increasing attention to people that they find attractive. Just imagine 11 or 12-year-old, maybe more so for some people 13, 14, or 15, really starting to notice people that they're attracted to, and starting to experience being aroused, as far as vasocongestion and things like that goes, in the presence of someone that they're attracted to. And so this increased reactivity, the physiological reactivity, so like vasocongestion, which if you remember for men, that's an erection, and or boys, that's an erection, and girls, it would be lubrication and things like that. And so that seems to be related with gonadal steroids in the key brain areas, like we were talking about before, like the hypothalamus in the pituitary gland. So let's start talking about sexual behavior in adolescence. We're going to talk about same-sex attraction in adolescence and masturbation mostly, but also some getting into partnered sexual behavior. So Fortenberry theorizes that during adolescence, this is a period of exploration, kind of figuring out for oneself, like, what is my gender even, but more than that, who am I attracted to? Am I mostly attracted to same sex, opposite sex, equally attracted to both, or for some people not necessarily really developing this attraction and whatnot for asexual folks. And so masturbation obviously increases during adolescence as compared to childhood, even though there is some like self-pleasuring in the genitals for some children, much greater increase in actual masturbation and orgasm and things like that in adolescence. And of course, partnered sexual activity increases in adolescence as well, just thinking about kissing, touching, all that sort of stuff. And then, maybe some of the older adolescents actually having intercourse or oral sex and things like that. One of those, major surveys, National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior, that we've talked about a lot, showing that adolescent partnered sexual activity, especially like, let's say in high school, there are countless movies of adolescents who are having sex with each other and all this sort of stuff. And this National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior just shows pretty definitively that partnered sexual activity for adolescents is not nearly as high as it's portrayed in the media. Check out this video that I found on adolescents and their sexuality, just the first 6 minutes and 30 seconds. It's a really good video on this person who is very well versed in adolescent sexuality, and she gives a good synopsis of pubertal changes, but also sexual activity as well. And I'll have that link in the description below, so you can just copy and paste that in and watch that, and I'll test you on that material. So she talks a lot, like I said, about sexual behaviors, and then she talks about romantic relationships, so in adolescence. So that's pretty interesting. Alright, so let's talk about masturbation in adolescence. Like I was saying before, obviously, some self-pleasuring in childhood, like before 10 years old or before 9 years old, but masturbation definitely increasing a lot during the adolescence phase. And as you would guess, if I asked you guys, do you think that do adolescents tend to masturbate more, or do they tend to have intercourse more? I think most of y'all would probably guess that masturbation is more common than partnered sexual activity for these guys. And if you just look at girls 16 to 19 years old, about 26% of them say that they masturbated during the previous month, and same age range, 16 to 19-year-old boys, about 60% of them say, yeah, I masturbated in the previous month. And then, but if you broaden it up a little bit and just say, have you ever masturbated, sort of thing. So by age 19, about 66% of adolescent girls saying, yeah, I masturbated at least once. And then for boys, about 86% of them by age 18, by age 19, masturbating at least once. And I'm not sure, is this like the definitive statistics on this sort of thing? My guess is that it's more of an approximation. It may be that 97% of males by the time that they're 18 have tried to like self-pleasure in some way. So it's not we don't know for sure, of course, these statistics, but this is what we have according to Hembernick in 2010. And most psychologists consider masturbation as an important avenue for sexual expression in adolescence. So as far as, parents trying to decide whether masturbation is okay for their adolescent and whatnot, most psychologists saying that it's important to, allow them to do this sort of thing. And why is it healthy? Well, one reason is because it's always an available outlet for pent-up sexual tension and things like that. A lot of the same benefits that adults get from masturbating, so relaxation, being able to sleep better, things like that. But of course, thinking about these adolescents and their burgeoning sexuality and whatnot, masturbation is a way to learn more about, what feels good to them, which can, turn into knowledge later in life that can be helpful for them once they start to engage in more partnered sexual behavior. So in my last human sexuality course, I polled the class anonymously, and just to kind of get some statistics of my own of what may be like normative adolescent sexual behavior. So I asked the question, I self-pleasured when I was an adolescent, true or false. And so only about half of the class, my class at the time was 104 students, and only about half of them answered. But if you break it down into the ones who answered, about 77% of the class say, yes, when I was around 14, 15, 16, I masturbated, and then about 22% of the class saying, no, I never masturbated when I was an adolescent. So a lot of people, you're kind of seeing this trend here of, by and large over in adolescence that there's this development in sexuality, but it's not like right when everyone becomes like 12 or 13, then all of a sudden everybody has already masturbated or masturbating like 3 times a day or whatever like that. It's much more gradual over the age changes throughout our adolescence. And then another question, which is a little tangential, but we can go over it. I also asked them the question. I was taught that masturbation was healthy, as an adolescent, and only 18% said that they were actually taught this, maybe like from their parents or someone else. So, by and large, most people being probably taught either that, probably taught nothing about masturbation from their parents, or even some saying that masturbation is being taught that masturbation is evil or things or sinful, things like that. So quite a high percent, 82% being taught, not taught that masturbation was healthy. As far as the readings and whatnot in chapter 12, read from page 375 to 400. So this week, finish that chapter up if you haven't already. And then as far as chapter 13, make sure you read all of that. And then sexual difficulties and solutions, read all of that. So this is more reading this week than normal, but just by a little bit. Alright, so we're continuing the discussion on adolescent sexuality. I found a really interesting figure that I'll show you here that kind of illustrates the development of sexuality in adolescence. Let me look that up real quick. Alright, so here it is right here. Let me zoom in so you can see this. So it's milestones in adolescent psychosexual development. So, and this is from a prominent handbook. I'll tell you what the source is in a second after I talk about it first. And in any case, they got it from Reynolds in 2003. But so around age 9 being the first sexual arousal. And I know your book talks about how I guess younger boys can have erections, but I guess it's up to debate whether that's actually considered sexual arousal. It could be just purely physiological, but at least Reynolds theorizing that sexual arousal for a lot of adolescents starts around 9 years old. But then, and that's kind of interesting, not until about 11 years old for boys, their first sexual attraction, to where they're actually like notice a particular person who arouses them sexually. And note that for females, it's not usually until age 14. So that's pretty interesting. And then, so it's not until like age 13 for the first orgasm for boys, most of boys. So obviously they've hit puberty before this happens. And then first orgasm for girls is not really until 16. And the first sexual intercourse can be anywhere from 13 to 20 is like the average and whatnot. And I'm surprised about this. I think this one could probably use a little research on this, the first sexual fantasy. And so for boys, it's around 11, and then adolescent girls around 14. And let's see if there's much difference. And then here's the homosexual sample. First sexual attraction around the same time. Sexual fantasy around the same time. First sexual arousal a little bit later, this is saying. I'd have to go into the actual research, but this is Rosario in 1996. And then first same-sex sex. So that's around 14. That's interesting. So the first first time they had sex with the other sex is around 13, but then the first time they had sex with the same sex was about a year after that. That's interesting. And then not having the actual lesbian gay identity until about 16. So this is pretty interesting. This is just like one little figure here. But you get a lot out of it and whatnot. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, this is from, let's see, it's on the slide. Adolescent Sexuality and Sexual Behavior Mental Health Handbook. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. Alright, so now let's talk about partnered sexual behavior in adolescence. We talked about masturbation in adolescence last time. So let's talk about partnered sexual behavior now. And first, let's talk about, in your book, it uses the term coitus, so non-coital, so non-intercourse sexual expression, so like kissing, holding, all these sort of things. It can be any of these things. I wonder if oral stimulation, I guess most researchers don't consider that coitus, or don't consider that intercourse. So it looks like oral sex has really started to increase among teenagers in the last like 10 or 20 years. And a lot of them see that this is like a way that they can express themselves sexually with another person, so they may feel like, oh, I know that intercourse would be like too much of a jump for me. I think that a lot of people kind of go step by step. A lot of people do. So kind of ranging from things like kissing and then kind of build up to intercourse. But it seems like teenagers feel a little bit more comfortable pushing the boundaries by going all the way up to things like oral sex. and they seem to appreciate like being able to do those sort of behaviors and whatnot, and feel close to their partner during this time. And so about by the time someone is 19, and remember we just like went over that psychosexual development figure from a second ago. This says by about age 19, about 60% of teenagers have engaged in oral sex, and that pretty well goes about with what we just learned. Maybe what we just learned in the adolescent handbook has more to do with first sexual intercourse around anywhere until like 21, so kind of the same sort of stuff. And so a recent study has showed that oral sex, the more if a adolescent has had oral sex, the more likely that they are going to have had sexual intercourse as well. So that kind of tells me that once they start having oral sex, that kind of shortly thereafter they're starting to have actual sexual intercourse. One of the biggest problems about sexuality and adolescence in general is that they tend not to think so much about the potential consequences of their actions. So, things like contracting sexually transmitted infections, and also getting pregnant and things like that. So a lot of the literature on adolescence and sexuality is like very, very cautious as far as like, we're not just like teaching all these teenagers to go out and have sex and stuff like that, but it's much more cautious, and things on topics such as like sexual education and things like that. Yeah. And a lot of these teenagers don't even know that they can contract infections from oral sex. So last class that I had about a year ago, the human sexuality class, I asked them the question. So I engaged in non-coital sexual behavior before age 18. So that's, anything like kissing, touching, oral sex, things like that. And they said, so about 75% of them said, yeah, that I engaged in sexual behavior before 18, and but still a significant amount still saying no. Even by the time I was 18, I still hadn't done that much with other people. I forgot what the stats were on the masturbation question that I asked, but I assume that there was a even higher percentage of people by the time that they're 18 had masturbated. So, adolescence sexting is definitely a big topic right now, and I think a subject of a lot of research as well. I've heard of a lot of students, like in high school and whatnot, sending sexual pictures and whatnot, not really thinking about the repercussions a lot of time of these sort of things. And I don't know. I mean, of course, like I feel like it could be healthy in some ways, like with a trusted person who you really know well, sort of thing, versus it sounds like a lot of these sexual pictures and stuff is like pressured, especially boys, like pressuring girls to send naked pictures of themselves and whatnot. The girls do this because they want, attention or something like that. And then the boys will show other people the pictures and whatnot, and it can have like really bad repercussions for the person who took the picture originally. But I know there can be like legal action to anyone who distributes that sort of thing. So still, because these girls are under 18, the people who just distribute it can be convicted of child pornography type stuff. So it's pretty interesting. So if you're not aware of what sexting is sending or receiving any sort of suggestive or explicit sort of photo. But as far as like one of the definitions that researchers use, it's not just photos, could be text messages too. That's kind of kind of borders on the line of like cyber sex to me. So I would think that it would be mostly just photos, but could be sexually suggestive text messages as well. And so, see this recent research here, 2019, really showing how prevalent it is for teenagers and then also young adults, so people in y'all's age bracket and whatnot. About 40% of high schoolers have received a text message that had sexual content in it, and I bet that may be even higher now. So 40% was the estimate that was given in our textbook, which was published a few years ago. So I wonder if it's even higher now. And then about 20% of people saying that they sent one. And so I talked about this a little bit, coercive sexting. And it sounds like a good deal of people have experienced this, where someone's trying to push another person into sending out sexually related content. And then about 25% of people saying, yes, I distributed it, I forwarded it to another person. Okay, so let's switch to actual relationships and whatnot. So we're still talking about like partnered sexual activity in adolescence. Let's talk about actual relationships. So in late adolescence, so that like 17 years old, 70% have or are in a relationship, which is a good deal, good many, and much more people are much more likely to have sex, and much more likely to have sex regularly if they are in a relationship. So I think that like if you had some sort of graph showing like the older a teenager gets, I think by the time that they're like 18, 19 years old, much more likely that they've had intercourse by that time. So also increasing in likelihood of being in a romantic relationship. And notice that this is from 2003, so is probably about the same now as far as percent of adolescents in a relationship. But if you go back into the past, like more than, let's say 40, 50 years, I think that being in a relationship around this time, like age 17, is a lot more likely than like in the 50s. And having sex with one's boyfriend or girlfriend is much more popular now than like in the 50s or 60s. And it's showing as far as like how are adolescents different in this generation compared to maybe 2 or 3 generations previous. It seems like adolescents are starting to really value intimacy with another person a lot more, and they want to be around someone that they feel more, attached to and everything. So it's kind of like, in a way, almost like developing a little quicker as far as relationships and sex goes. But at the same time, like casual sexual relationships are really common as well. So you have a lot of adolescents maybe having a little bit more intercourse than they did 30, 40 years ago. And also in more relationships than they did as well. And so some other trends that are changing is that girls are definitely having sex more often than they were back in like the 50s and 60s. And then the more that boys are actually like, no, I want to have someone who I can feel close with and everything. So I think that's pretty interesting. Okay, so when I asked my last class that I taught, the question, I engaged in intercourse before age 18, true or false? A lot saying true, 61% saying true, and so that adds up pretty well to that figure that I showed you at the beginning of the class today. But it's still a substantial portion, almost 40% saying false, that by age 18, whether it's, the opportunity or not, or feeling ready or not feeling ready for intercourse. I think that's a really interesting research question, like not feeling ready for intercourse, like what do they anticipate intercourse to be like and things like that. So more about specifically adolescent intercourse. We just talked about relationships a little bit, but let's talk about adolescents having intercourse. So I think that maybe a lot of you guys could cringe a little bit when I mention like adolescents having intercourse, and I think that could be due to the fact that a lot of people are like, oh, are you going to actually like be safe while you're having sex, as in like having birth control and a condom and all these sort of things. And it's just like, it begs the question of just like, are adolescents really ready for intercourse and whatnot? Just knowing the risks of still becoming pregnant, even using 1 or even 2 means of birth control and whatnot. And but if you're thinking of like 17-year-olds, maybe this is like a developmentally appropriate behavior. But if you're thinking more so like 13 years old, I think that's a big difference. 13-year-olds having intercourse versus 17-year-olds. So I think 13-year-olds having intercourse, I'd be like really curious as to like what is going on there, if they just feel kind of this internal or even external pressure to like do mature type of behaviors and whatnot. So I'd really wonder whether they feel ready themselves and actually want to have intercourse. But the 17-year-old, even them, I would think that they may be still like pushing themselves a little bit to be like an adult or whatever. But they may, like we were talking about, be in a relationship, have been in a relationship for a year or so, and they want to have that intimacy, and at the same time, they have enough forethought to really think about not becoming pregnant. But if you just think of like two guys who are in a relationship, then you don't have to worry so much about getting pregnant and stuff. So yeah, just something to consider. So as far as the prefrontal cortex development, this is more so just adolescents being able to think, not only like get caught up in all of their emotions and anticipation about sex and pleasure and all that sort of stuff, not just to like get caught up in that, but also to like think about potential consequences of the act. So having sex with someone that they don't really know and is unprotected, or having sex and without birth control and things like that. So not really thinking about future consequences and whatnot. So if you're interested in what differentiates some adolescents from abstaining from early intercourse? Let's say you're interested in having a kid, and you know that they'll be an adolescent one day, and you're like, well, what are some things that I can do to try to reduce the likelihood that they're going to have intercourse? Just having that parental supervision is going to help a lot, because you see in the opposing cases that the adolescents who are having more intercourse and whatnot typically don't have that parental supervision and whatnot. And a lot of kiddos who have their parents who are abusing substances and maybe unemployed, things like that, and a lot of family conflict, that tends to be like who has sex earliest. And so it's an interesting question to like wonder, what it is about that. And I wonder if it's just they know that they can get away with it sort of thing, as opposed to like more affluent type families and whatnot. They feel like the adolescents feel like they may not can get away with that sort of thing. So basically that factor of adult supervision versus no adult supervision, I think, is like very important as far as preventing early intercourse. So let's look at the late intercourse predisposing factors. We just looked at early intercourse and predisposing factors. Let's look at late intercourse. Strong religious beliefs, as you would imagine. Good school performance. So I think adolescents who have good school performance also have good ability to, look at something in the future like career or college and stuff like that, and they they're able to say, I want to take all the actions I need to do so that I have a successful future and whatnot. So they're able to be like, oh, I don't know if I should have intercourse or not. Higher socioeconomic status and higher quality of parent-child relationship and communication. And I think late intercourse here is, something more like 19, the first time that they have intercourse, or maybe even after that. And I think that most parents do not want their adolescents, even if they are 17, to have intercourse and feel like that they are not ready yet and whatnot. So if they have a good relationship with their child, I think that more likely the child's like, yeah, I think you're actually right that maybe I shouldn't do this until I'm in a more serious, committed relationship. And this is just an interesting little tidbit from researcher Willoughby here, saying that adolescents who wait to have sexual intercourse till later in life tend to have good positive relationship outcomes. So most likely the ones who are having sex early in relationships maybe are very focused on just having sex and they're not really focused on the relationship. But adolescents who wait till later to have sex are also wanting to have, positive romantic relationships as well. So here are some reasons that most adolescents give for engaging in intercourse. Well, the reasons are down here. So curiosity and a sense of readiness, affection for one's partner, so kind of wanting to like deepen their relationship with their girlfriend or boyfriend. And then push to adult behavior, so wanting to kind of be mature and things like that. But as far as biological explanations for why adolescents start to have intercourse and whatnot, and that's obviously because of puberty and acceleration of sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen and things like that, so more of a desire to have sex and whatnot, the biological system saying, all right, I'm ready to reproduce and things like that. All right, so let's talk about same-sex sexual behavior in adolescence, and as we'll see that there's kind of especially in adolescence, it can be throughout one's lifetime, but especially in adolescence, that curiosity of trying to kind of figure out, you hear, it's like all these adults especially who are saying like, I'm heterosexual or homosexual, bisexual, all these sexual orientation identities and whatnot, and they wonder themselves, I know that I'm attracted to this person, but I haven't had much experience, like actual sexual behavior with another person and whatnot. So I'm just kind of still wondering, like, I wonder what my orientation actually is. So you have some same-sex behavior that's kind of experimental, but then obviously some same-sex behaviors in adolescence that are more a long-standing, like they are actually, fall within that LGBT group and whatnot. So like experimenters, and then people who are actually gay or bisexual. So about 1 in 10 teenagers report same-sex contact. I'd love to see if that's increased in the past 9-10 years. And I would assume that it has, maybe even up to 2 in 10 teenagers reporting same-sex contact, but at least in 2011, 1 in 10 teenagers reporting it. The CDC in 2018 saying about 7% of youths have same-sex contact. So that's about the same, 10%. 10% versus 7%. And then, that's what I was saying, can be experimental and transitory. Or it can be like a long-standing actual orientation type thing. And so the CDC estimates that 15% of youth are either lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, and or questioning. So that's a good percent of good substantial percent of people. So like one of the main percentages that we learned during the sexual orientation chapter was like about maybe 5% of adults, maybe especially like men, identifying as homosexual. And then we're seeing as many as 15% of youths identifying within the LGBTQ community. So keep track of those percentages and whatnot, and see, some of these questions of like, is same-sex behavior, just increasing in acceptability in our society, so more and more people feel comfortable doing that sort of thing, or is it truly that more people are starting to be attracted to the same sex and whatnot? And I wonder if it's mostly people are feeling more comfortable about doing that sort of thing, and maybe that's why we're seeing such high numbers. So 4% of those saying that they're questioning, which is like a very, very important, the Q can stand for queer, or it can stand for questioning. And I think that a lot of adolescents questioning is a very important sexual orientation, like I said, especially in adolescence. But of course, like I was just saying, that overall in our society, that same-sex experiences and whatnot are more acceptable within our society and whatnot now than compared to 50, 60 years ago. Our society still is very heteronormative in that, like in high schools and whatnot, girls and boys being seen as gay or lesbian being bullied by other people within the school and whatnot. So LGBTQ youths and whatnot still have a lot to battle against for the most part. Even this recent research is talking about that as well. So a lot of LGBTQ adolescents dealing with depression and loneliness, alcohol and substance abuse, compulsive sexual behavior, poor school performance, and suicide attempts. I know with transgender people in general, that the suicide attempts are really high And I'd imagine that it's the same for those adolescents as well. So, this is still a major problem in our society of LGBTQ adolescents being able to, be who they are without all of this stigma and whatnot that is in our society. And just open hostility towards those groups as well. And so obviously that depression and loneliness and all that sort of stuff doesn't arise from nowhere. It arises from all of the aggression from other adolescents and whatnot who are, trying to keep these kids down and whatnot. So a lot of verbal abuse towards LGBTQ adolescents and bullying and all of these sort of things. So major problem in our society and in our schools, in our high schools, and high schools in general need to be especially aware of this, and I think especially aware in like private Christian schools and whatnot as well, because then you maybe even have like the faculty and people like that being, also against homosexuality and things like that. So there's a lot to be done in our society and in our schools and public schools for making the space safe for LGBTQ adolescents. And it's really important to consider that, these gay and lesbian adolescents are not able oftentimes to talk to their parents either. So they're being bullied at school, and then they come home and they can be bullied there as well. So it's just not a workable situation for them. A lot of these kiddos being disowned by their family. It's I know that some of you may have been your own. You've been possibly disowned yourself, and that's terrible. But for I think most of us, we don't really know what it's like to be disowned for our sexual orientation and what a bind that puts an adolescent in who is supposed to be developing their sexual identity and whatnot at this time. So they're really put in a very hard place. Homelessness, mental, physical, and emotional consequences, obviously, to all of this that we're talking about. And it's so important, how I think that is possible, but it's a big challenge. Self-acceptance is for these lesbian and gay adolescents and transgender too. Self-acceptance in the face of so many other people not accepting them. So, as many friends as they can have, and hopefully supportive parents and hopefully supportive faculty at school and whatnot. It just can go, I feel like, in really different ways right now where we are in our society. Alright, so last topic for adolescence and sexuality. We're going to talk about sex education a little bit here, and not just sex education classes in high school and whatnot, but just general sexual education for adolescents in the home. So most adolescents have some sort of caregiver and whatnot, and they start developing more interest in sexuality. So what better resource than that there would be than their parents. And I know that it's really challenging for a lot of parents to talk about sexuality at all with their adolescents. They would kind of rather think that their adolescents aren't really all that sexual until they're at least 18 and out of the house and whatnot. So, but it seems like it's kind of like neglecting to talk to adolescents about sexuality and whatnot is kind of a little bit of a negligence, a little bit of a anxiety about it sort of thing, to where that anxiety stops the parents from actually talking about sexuality with their children, and this still just perpetuating this whole thing where we keep sexuality so hush hush and whatnot. So it's kind of funny that, like, if you ask parents why have they not talked to their children about sexuality and whatnot, a lot of them say, well, in high school, the sex education teacher is going to talk to them about it anyway, so I don't have to have the awkward conversation about talking about sexuality. I think a lot of parents are like, well, if I talk about sexuality with my children, then my children will feel awkward because they're thinking about, mom and dad or whatever having sex and whatnot. So they just avoid the whole situation thing. And so, our book's authors, Crooks and Bauer, think that it's good to start children having some sort of conversation about sexuality and whatnot even early on. So I'm not sure if I would say like necessarily childhood, but like once the interest starts arising in these sort of things. So like maybe 11 or 12, something like that, starting to talk about those sort of things. So I think this is a good question. Like, what are some of the things that your friends tell you about sex? So that can be good just to, be able to see into their lives a little bit and whatnot. And Crooks and Bauer advocate the parents sharing their true feelings. So they may be like, I'm really anxious talking to you about sex and whatnot because it's a very mature sort of thing, and just depending on your relationship with your kid, like how you would feel about talking to them about this sort of stuff. Some parents may feel excited. They're like, oh, I'm glad that you get to experience this thing that's so awesome of being human and whatnot, as in being in romantic relationships and being sexual in one way or another, even if it's just kissing and holding hands and stuff like that. So there's all sorts of feelings that a parent could have when approaching their adolescent and talking, having the sex talk. And see, even that is like, we're only going to talk about this once. There's a sex talk, and it's uncomfortable. We're going to talk about it once. Usually, like, falls on the wife, and I don't know. Let's check out page 373 to see if there's anything useful on there. Crooks and Bauer suggesting that parents initiate conversations about sexuality even if their children don't initiate conversations. Let's see. Less interesting. Yeah, so let's see. So this is just an example from your book about this sort of thing. So this is more so like very early. This is more so like childhood, going into adolescence. So one day my 7-year-old joined me on the couch to watch a football game. He was still in the process of toweling off from a shower while he appeared to be engrossed in the activity on the screen. I noticed one hand was busy stroking his penis. Suddenly his eyes caught mine, observing him. An uneasy grin crossed his face. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I simply stated, "It feels good, doesn't it?" He didn't say anything. This might be the first time that they ever had a conversation about this, the parent and the kid. He didn't say anything, nor did he continue touching himself, but a smile grew a little wider. I must admit I had some initial hesitancy in openly indicating my approval for such behavior. I was afraid he might begin openly masturbating in the presence of others. However, my fears were demonstrated to be groundless in that he continues to be quite private about such activity. It's gratifying to know that he can experience the pleasures of his body without the unpleasant guilt feelings that his father grew up with. So that's definitely like a different approach to those first conversations a parent would have with their kids. I think a lot of parents would either just avoid it completely or shut it down completely, sort of thing. And so that just doesn't seem the healthiest, as opposed to actually engaging in a full-on conversation about these sort of things, so that you can say, these are all the good things about sexuality. These are all the, potential consequences or things like that about sexuality. See, this parent was like, I'm not going to have my kid just like openly masturbating in front of other people, so that's good. But also she's like, I'm also going to communicate to him that masturbation is okay and healthy and things like that. So I think that was pretty interesting, that little quote on top of page 373. So that'll be on our material for adolescence. And so now we're going to move to, we're kind of taking like last week and this week we've kind of taken like a lifespan approach or developmental approach to sexuality. So we didn't talk too much about childhood, but we talked about adolescence, and now we're going to talk about adulthood.